Right.
All right. Hello, everyone. Greetings and welcome to our first seminar of the semester. And this year, this semester, I should say, we're having a theme of books. So all the seminars are going to be focused on a book, and we'll invite the author to present the book. And I think it's especially useful for our PhD students, as many of you will be working on monographs later for your dissertations and beyond, have a book published. And so it's, I think, particularly important for our human geography students, but also you'll be surprised how many of the physical geographers also end up with books at some point as well. And if you really want to make an impact in terms of your global footprint, a book is very important. Don't just listen to what the usual curmudgeon academics will say that, oh, just do journal papers. Journal papers are fine, but books matter, and I think also our guests will also talk about some of the ways in which perhaps you can, pitch books later and so on. The way we'll do the seminar as before, we'll have about 30 to 40-minute presentation by our speaker, then we'll have a general discussion with everyone, including the faculty, and then we usually the faculty leave and give the graduate students a bit of quality time as well, so that you don't feel in any way intimidated by us. While since we're a small intimate group, I thought we might also just have a quick intro so people know each other a bit more. And so before I introduce the speaker, I'm actually going to do a quick lightning round of the faculty who are here, and then just the students, just mention like country of origin or location or where you're from, or rural Pennsylvania, whatever, and then something about your topic. Okay. So and I'm only going to do it for people here, the online people we won't get to. That's one of the privileges of being in person there, because I'm also trying to get people to incentivize them to physically come to the seminars. We keep the Zoom option, but so Julie.
Oh, hi. I'm Julie Klinger, human geographer here. Work on energy critical materials from subterranean deposits to outer space.
Yeah.
And I'm Dan Leathers. I'm a climatologist, meteorologist. I'm also from Williamsport.
Oh my gosh. Uh-oh.
Strong opinions about this.
All right.
There we go. That's a wonderful way.
I'm Troy. I'm a new faculty member focusing on extreme weather and hurricanes.
Hurricanes, and yeah, Troy just joined. This is his first seminar that he did his Princeton postdoc. So you were close by to fracking country, but so you're familiar with some of the controversies in this part of the country. Stina.
Hi, Christina Archer. I'm a faculty here in geography as well. I do research on wind energy mostly.
Great. Now the students. Yes, please.
Sure. I'm Gwen. I'm a first year PhD, and I'm interested in spatial statistics and environmental statistics.
Okay. Yes.
I'm from India. I'm a PhD student, and I'm working with Dr. working basically on solid distribution.
Great. Okay, Nora.
Hi, my name is Nora Lucas. I'm a second year master's student from Kansas City, Kansas, and my research is on environmental pollution issues in southern Delaware with the Fulton.
Hello, my name is Mehrnaz. I'm from Iran. I'm a second year PhD student here, and I'm working on indigenous water sovereignty in Colorado River Basin.
Hi, my name is Faisal. I'm a third year PhD student and I'm from Bangladesh. So I basically study the geopolitics of knowledge production and climate change and development.
I'm from China. I'm working this year. PhD student here in Delaware, and my research focuses on sustainable systems.
Hi, I'm Madan. I'm from India. I'm a second year PhD student, and I use GIS to see the types of climate change that goes to ecosystems.
Hi, my name is Ryan. I'm a PhD student. I'm working in water science and policy.
Hi, my name is Zubair Mohammed. I'm a second year PhD student. I'm from Nigeria. And my research, I'm working on using satellite systems to planning the impact of climate change on vegetation.
My name is Emmanuel Chikaga. I'm from Malawi. I'm working on economic structural methods and sustainable supply chain in Namibia.
Yes, and my name is Iggy. I'm from Ethiopia. I'm working on preparing the global creativity.
Great.
My name is Kelly Jacobs. I'm a third year energy and environmental policy PhD student, and my research relates to grassroots activist efforts, switching from fracking to ethane cracking. That's plastic production.
Okay, fantastic. Well, now it's my real pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Colin Jerolmack from NYU. Please correct me with my pronunciation. Colin is professor of environmental studies and sociology at New York University. And he is someone who's very close to also this area geographically. He grew up in Philadelphia. He went to Drexel University for his undergrad, then did his PhD at CUNY, and then he's been in New York for most of his career. He is a sociologist who does sort of deep dive ethnographic fieldwork, which is just marvelous. And I think some of the lessons from his research are so applicable to many of what our students are doing in terms of doing, sort of long-term studies of communities, understanding how their mindset changes around natural resource issues and so on. He's the author of another book, first one, which is a fascinating book published by University of Chicago Press called The Global Pigeon. And it was basically an ethnography of how people interact with pigeons in urban settings, and in some cases they breed pigeons, which I didn't know about. There were different men in New York who love breeding pigeons on the rooftops, and that was widely acclaimed as a really marvelous book in the University of Chicago's ethnography series. He's also done an anthology on ethnographic methods. And so those of you who will be using ethnography for your research, that's a great anthology to look at. And then this book that he wrote, which was published by Princeton University Press, Up to Heaven and Down to Hell, he wrote it for a general audience. And that's also one of the points of discussion maybe he'd like to have around towards the end of the talk is, how to write a good book, which is both peer-reviewed. So Princeton University Press, obviously peer-reviewed, but accessible for a large audience. So he went through a book agent, and the book was auctioned, and he had an offer from a trade publisher, but he chose to go with Princeton. And that's one of my goals also with this book seminar series, is to get people to think about also the publishing process. We don't want you all publishing with Routledge and the easy publisher. Sorry, but I have to say that's what it is. That I publish with Routledge too, but it's the way it is. We want you to figure out how to do it with high quality houses, So thank you for taking time from your sabbatical, Colin, to come and share your thoughts with us, the book itself, and highly recommend you all get it. Kelly even had got one and a signed copy. Hopefully you got it.
Oh yeah, I forgot. I'll do that for you. Yeah.
So over to you.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. And thanks everybody. I just like to jump right into it. So if I ever had to leave this property, I'd suck on a gun barrel. These were the words that George Hagemeyer, at the time a 58-year-old retired custodian and proud country boy, stated to me the first time I met him when he was looking out the kitchen window of his modest farmhouse at the modest swath of lawn of his 77 acres, once tended by his father. George never knew his father. When he was 2 years old, he's the youngest of 7. His father went outside, put up a ladder to hang plastic over the windows before the biting winter wind swept in December, fell off, cracked his head open on a rock, and bled out. So George never left home, though. He stayed home with his mother to raise a girl that his sister was going to give up for adoption, that he considers to be his own daughter now, and then to care for his mother until her own death in 2008. A bachelor to this day, he's inherited what he calls my daddy's land. And it's through his land that he feels like he gets to know and attach to his father. To be the steward of his father's 77-acre plot, which is tucked away in a secluded mountain hollow outside of Williamsport, Pennsylvania, in Lycoming County, is, as he says, all I ever wanted. When I met him, Anadarko Petroleum Corporation was in the midst of drilling 6 natural gas wells on a 4-acre pad it had cleared just 800 feet behind his house. He admitted that there was a lot of disturbances he hadn't anticipated. Hundreds of big rig trucks rumbling in and out, a security guard shack positioned at the entrance to his driveway, all kinds of signs put up warning, pedestrians, if there would be any, of heavy truck traffic. But nevertheless, despite these disruptions that he conceded shattered the rural serenity that he held dear, George remarked to me in that first meeting, "I just think it's neat. They ought to make me a spokesperson for Anadarko because I'm just so darn thrilled with what they're doing." I had a pretty good idea why he might be darn thrilled with what they were doing. George was drawing a modest pension from his, from being a custodian of the high school. He had, his linoleum floor was crisscrossed with duct tape. He had a tarp hastily thrown on the roof of his house. By the time I left Williamsport 1 year later, he got his first royalty check for gas from those 6 wells, $34,000 for 1 month of production. Few leaseholders I met around Greater Williamsport made as much money as George did. Most of them didn't. But they all reaped some financial rewards in the fracking lottery. So you have land, you might only have 1 acre, you might have 300 acres. By the way, even if you're relatively poor, you might be the 4th or 5th generation who's inherited this land. So owning a lot of land does not mean in this context that you're wealthy. So when you lease it up front to the energy firms, if they want to be able to extract gas, they have to come to you and you lease it. America is the only country in the world where the predominant form of land ownership includes air rights and mineral rights. Whoever owns the soil, it is theirs up to heaven and down to hell, as it says in American common law. So you lease your property, you might get as little as $25 an acre. You might have gotten as much as $1,500 an acre, depending on if you collectively bargained, when you signed. The real life-changing money, though, that continues is if you get royalties. So they lease everybody up, then they decide which are the most lucrative places to drill. And if they drill horizontally underneath you, then you can get royalties on a month-to-month basis. So when I first moved to Williamsport, what I thought I was going to write about was, because this was the way at the time anyway that the media was kind of portraying communities that were on the front line of shale gas extraction, which is happening in Texas, Colorado, Oklahoma, North Dakota, et cetera, with that it's kind of tearing communities apart. Half of them are for it, half of them are against it. And that's not what I found. Almost everybody leased. There was very little resistance to it at all. And we now know what I didn't know then, because there's now been great surveys done, especially by, for instance, federal adoption. The closer you live to an oil gas well, the more likely you are to support it. Most places where shale gas and oil extraction is heavily occurring has strong support for it, right? Anti-fracking activism, not entirely, but you could say is largely a not in your backyard movement. People that do not live over the shale that are going and trying to stop development there, right? It's not a not in my backyard movement. So fracking remains one of today's most consequential and contentious land uses. The sort of boom seemed to be over for natural gas, and then Russia invaded Ukraine, and all of a sudden we're now exporting more liquefied natural gas to Germany and elsewhere, right? So you get the idea, right? But these kind of analyses of how it's transforming geopolitics and when and how it affects peak oil, for instance, can miss how personal fracking is. The energy revolution of fracking in the United States anyway is not really a collective decision. It was not a country, or it was not states, it was not communities that said, are we going to frack or not to frack? The only exception is New York State, which is the only state of 33 states with shale oil and gas deposits that ban fracking. Otherwise, the way that fracking actually plays out, especially because of the Halliburton loophole, which means that fracking is more or less not regulated by the federal government, is that it is a series of thousands of individual decisions where a property owner directly negotiates with an oil and gas company to make the individual decision on whether I will lease my own mineral rights, right? Some of you might have seen fictional portrayals like Promised Land where the community holds a vote. There's no such thing. There's no community vote on if you're going to allow fracking or not, right? And so this energy revolution is actually thousands of individual families deciding on their own that collectively creates a fracking boom in this way, right? And so this ostensibly private decision, I think, which is pretty apparent, has public consequences. We can think about the planetary abstract ones. Methane, which is what natural gas is itself a potent greenhouse gas. And even though when you burn it, it burns cleaner than coal, it still is emitting carbon emissions. Methane leakage is a huge problem, right? And then, of course, there's the local and the visceral. Any of you were familiar when it was very controversial when it came out, Gasland, right? Made people aware of some of the concerns there might be about water contamination. There's also potential air contamination, particularly low-level ozone, just from all the generators and heavy truck traffic. And and also more sort of intangible ways, like the way a massive industrial process might affect what people call rural character of a place, right? So, you know, just to give you a little, so this is actually the well pad in George's backyard. In the background are the actual gas wells, which you can't see here because this is here, but they just like look like little fire hydrants. But in the front, the gas is so pipeline ready. There's just tiny liquid impurities. They just burn them off right on site. So these 6 dehydrators here just burn off the impurities right in its backyard. And now it's pipeline ready. A pipeline which you got extra $60,000 for, a 6-inch pipeline, goes across the edge of his property, rushes it off to a compressor station so it can be boosted and make its way to Philadelphia. But you could see, this is the kind of, but I should say, and I'll get this later, but George, while he knew there was gonna be a well pad, he didn't know all this stuff was gonna be here. He definitely knows it's gonna be there for 40 to 60 years, right? So there's those kinds of impacts. Here you can see, this is a pretty typical setup. There's a well pad after they fracked and everything, it kind of quiets down. There's a massive impoundment pond where they store the millions of gallons of water that they're going to use to frack the well. And when they drill a well, it is typical, though not always, and they're trying to do this less, but you want to see how productive it is. It's not yet hooked up to a pipeline, so you flare it, you burn off the gas. And let's see if it'll play the sound. Sometimes the sound isn't hooked up, but we'll try for it. If not, you'll still see the video, but you can see the sound from the
so you know, sort of whether you're looking around in this house and for that's a music property, it's actually nice time. It's like it's best because it's
right, while this is happening, it's just so you can't sleep even with earplugs, whatever. And so these kind of spillover effects on other people, right? These kind of public effects of this private decision to lease your land, right? So to step back a little bit and talk more about the broader kind of political context that already is existing within which fracking comes in. It's a recurring dilemma in American society. I would argue the most common, most pivotal political dilemma that structures many of the major controversies. How to balance individual freedom in the Commonwealth. My right to own an assault rifle versus its impact on the public good. My right to not vaccinate or not mask, which might make other people sick, right? I think you know which side we often come down on in this country compared to other countries, right? And so if we think about this kind of larger political issue within fracking, everybody I spoke to who owned land said, it's my right to lease my land and do whatever the hell I want with my property. It's nobody else's business. Nobody should have a say in how I use my property, right? However, they also believed that their neighbors were equally entitled to that right. And they also believed in being a good neighbor, right? Well, I don't want to be a jerk, and I would never want to destroy my neighbor's property. So on the sort of being a good neighbor side, not destroying my community side, it would seem that your neighbors having some say in your land use decision should be, should be a part of this, right? So, and we could think about this kind of political dilemma about my individual rights versus the public good as, of course, I'm framing in political terms, it's a resource dilemma. Pretty typical one, right? The pursuit of self-interest results in the degradation of shared resource harming the common good, right? Resource dilemmas are often talked about and even experienced in the abstract. Few of us are forced to reckon with the public impacts of our private decisions, which often might be climate refugees in some other place, might be future generations. Shale communities are in the unenviable position of having to confront a resource dilemma face to face at the fence post, Little League, church, and the like, right? Because my neighbor immediately experiences some impacts from what I'm doing in this way. So I was really interested in the lived experience of this resource dilemma. I moved to Williamsport, Pennsylvania. I lived there for 8 months, but then I kept up with the people that I met for 7 years afterwards. And really, when I say Williamsport, that's where I lived. That's the one small city in the area, but I'm talking about landowners who lived around and outside of Williamsport on anywhere from 2 acres to 500 acres, right? As soon as you get outside of the town, it gets pretty rural pretty quick. And that's mostly what I'm talking about. So I'm going to talk about a piece of the book today. In particular, I'm going to try to make 2 main points or arguments, which maybe animate like 4 or 5 of the chapters of what is a 12-chapter book. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is how against economistic presumptions, local support for fracking can't be explained just by personal benefit, right? It's not just about the money you make or the jobs you might get and the like. The second thing I'm going to talk about is how people often justified land leasing in the language of individual liberty, my right to do what I want on my own property, but land sovereignty has the ironic effect of eroding other people's liberty. So, and then I'm going to conclude with some lessons for thinking about how to do environmental politics and environmental activism in rural contexts. All right, so what I'm going to say next, some of you may know, but we've known that there's layers, that there's deep layers of shale rock a mile or more underneath the ground in much of the heartland that contain molecules of gas and oil for a long time. We didn't know how to get it in a way that was profitable. Right? And so the big revolution, we often talk about, we call fracking, and often used as a blanket term for the entire process. But fracking, as the industry loves to tell us, has actually been going on for a while. Fracking itself is actually hydraulic fracturing, which is the injection of, at high pressure, millions of gallons of water, which breaks open the rock. That's been going on since at least the 40s. The innovation that really allowed us to make this profitable was horizontal drilling, which didn't come about until the early 2000s. So you drill down with a remote control drill bit, let's say it's like a mile deep. As you approach the shale layer, you start to arc that drill bit so that it goes horizontally up to 2 miles horizontally, right? And now you're making it worthwhile because you're only getting a tiny bit of oil and gas that you break up right in that rock, right? So they drill down, drill horizontally, drop down depth charges basically with ball bearings in them that explode, shoot holes through these rocks. Then they pump down at high volume millions of gallons of water and sand or a synthetic kind of sand and biocides. And the water makes the cracks open up even more. Sand's as small as it is, it holds the cracks open enough for the oil and gas to come back out. In Pennsylvania, it's all gas. As you go west of the Rockies, it's mostly oil, right? In Ohio, Pennsylvania is pretty much gas. So that's the basic process here. Marcellus Shale deposit, which stretches from upstate New York down to West Virginia, is the largest shale gas deposit in the United States, one of the largest shale gas deposits in the world. Pennsylvanians, a lot of them were pretty darn excited when New York banned fracking because that meant that they were now going to be the epicenter of shale gas extraction on the East Coast, right? And so Pennsylvania now has what is it now? It's like 10,000 fracked wells at least, and all this from like 2008 onwards. And so there was this. So how did I get interested in this? I'm from Pennsylvania. Not from the middle of Pennsylvania, I'm from over here, but in 2011, I remember a well-publicized report about how Pennsylvania was poised to become the Saudi Arabia of natural gas, right? That sounded really big, and so I sort of spent some time saying like to some of my grad students, somebody ought to go live in one of these communities and like see what's going on there. And they're all like, yeah, dude, I came to NYU in Manhattan because I want to be in New York City. So had a sabbatical coming up, it became me. So I picked Williamsport because for a few reasons. One, and it's like right here, it's not that big, but it's actually the biggest city within an hour-and-a-half drive in any direction, which meant that it became the economic and administrative hub for fracking for the entire northern tier of Pennsylvania. It also, Lycoming County, while it does not have the most drilled wells in Pennsylvania of counties, there's counties in the Southwest that have more, it had the most new drilled wells the year before I moved there. So I knew it was a place where a lot of action was happening at that time around drilling. So I moved to Pennsylvania in 2013. I followed up with people until 2020. Williamsport's also interesting because as far as its extractive history, there was a period in the late 1800s where it claimed to mill the most board feet of lumber in the world. And so it was the lumber capital of the world. And there was a beautiful row of Victorian homes, not all Victorian, but largely, called Millionaire's Row. And I lived in one of the former lumber barons' houses, which have been mansions, which have been subdivided into apartments. And so there's kind of long history of resource extraction. And arguably one could say its glory days were those days. You might know it now as the home of the Little League World Series, which actually takes place in South Williamsport, but Little League was invented in Williamsport. And when they talk about on ESPN, they still usually just say Williamsport. And so for 10 days, it's kind of viewed as this halcyon, heartland kind of experience, right, of little kids playing baseball. In addition, it does have a local art scene, and there's two local colleges nearby. But it also has suffered from deindustrialization, population decline. Its population was about 45,000 in 1960. It's now around 28,000, right? And so it does deal with a lot of the problems that so-called Rust Belt towns have experienced. Well, I don't want to reduce it to just being a typical Rust Belt town. So I will say the poverty rate for Williamsport is about twice as high as the state average as well. And so this is some economic context that when this opportunity comes in to make money through the industry, right? So Now, Williamsport itself, you know, it's a little city. It's got sidewalks, it's got cafes and such. As soon as you get outside, it gets pretty rural pretty quick. You can go 5 minutes in some directions and you're on mostly gravel or dirt roads. It's incredibly white and largely conservative. Trump won over 70% in both elections at the county level. Now, they don't measure at the city level. If you took out Williamsport, just kind of liberal, my guess is that rural area might be over 90% for Trump. That would be my guess, but I don't actually know. So it's, you know, it's a pretty white, pretty conservative region in that way. So all right, let me get into it. So my first thing I want to talk about is how you can't just explain support for fracking through economic benefits. So I'll return to George Hagemeyer, who I've introduced you to. George will not categorize himself politically, except as an American. I would, if I had to, categorize him as libertarian. He firmly believed, in his words, he had a God-given right to total autonomy over how he used his land, and he even felt a duty to recognize its productive value. My daddy farmed this land with vegetables, I farm it with gas. When I asked him whether the Department of Environmental Protection, municipal authorities, or the community should have a say over his decision to lease his land because it might impact them, his answer was brief: nope. I prodded him a little bit more to say more about it, and he answered curtly, "It's my land. I'll do as I damn well please." In turn, George believed it was none of his or the government's business what his neighbors did with their property. He bristled at any form of government intrusion, as he called it, onto his land, to the point that when the gas company put up, which they're legally required to do, safety signs at the entrance of his driveway warning of heavy truck traffic, he called his state representative every day for 3 weeks trying to get those signs taken down, right? Because he viewed that as government intrusion, that they say these signs have to be here, this is my land, right? So the moral elevation of individual sovereignty, private property rights, self-reliance is often what residents had in mind when, as many of them said, they would talk about how fracking fits with rural values. These beliefs, I want to argue, sustain support for fracking and antipathy for government intervention to regulate the industry, even when people experienced harms from the industry and didn't profit from the industry. Doyle and Peggy Bodle lived in a double-wide trailer, and after a gas well was drilled about 2,000 miles up the mountain, they had explosive levels of methane in their water. When they ran the dishwasher, it turned the dishes brown. That's the water that Doyle was going to put in the humidifier. Department of Environmental Protection did an investigation, confirmed that this was because of faulty cement casing at the gas well on the neighbor's property. While the Bodles were angry at the gas company for harming their water supply and were instigating a lawsuit against the company, Doyle emphasized, "Nobody held a gun to my head to lease my land." His support of individual choice entailed embracing the role of acting as his own actuary. He didn't want the government or some other expert to tell him how risky or not fracking was. Peggy, his wife, who was retired from working at the local Pop-Tarts factory, acknowledged that they knew beforehand that allowing drilling so close to their home entailed risk. She also admitted that they knew they weren't ever really going to get life-changing money because they only leased 2 acres. For $25 an acre, even the royalties wouldn't amount to more than $100, $200 a month at their peak. In rationalizing the decision to lease anyway, Peggy compared fracking to everyday risks that people accept in exchange for convenience. This is a quote. Everything at one point, they put stuff on it, like formaldehyde, when we were growing up, and we ate that. You could get lung cancer and not ever have smoked a cigarette in your life. Doyle, her husband, interjected. I agree with her. With all the chemicals we put on our crops today, you can't tell me they know all that stuff is 100% safe. Drawing a parallel to fracking, he added, it doesn't matter where you live, you could have water problems of some kind. And what he was alluding to, which is factually correct, there are over 5 million Pennsylvanians who drink unregulated private water wells. There's no regulations on it. It's up to you to determine if your drinking water is safe or not. And he has friends who can't drink their water, not because of fracking, but because sometimes it just tastes or smells like eggs, the sulfur in it, or because there's bacteria. And so he was sort of like, well, it might have been something else. Other people drink Poland Spring because of bacteria, right? So this happened to me, but something else could have happened to my water. The Bowles refused to conclude from their experience that greater government oversight of fracking was the answer. They didn't want more regulation, despite what had happened to them. Their inclination to distrust government agencies, including the DEP, may have made taking an anti-fracking position unappealing or even untenable, because they understood that the implied solution to managing risk, more government oversight of this industry, was inconsistent with their belief in self-determination, right? My ability to do what I want on my own property. Indeed, the Bodles and their neighbors were adamant that it wasn't their place to say or do anything that might impact their neighbors' ability to profit from fracking on their own property. So interestingly, complementing these appeals to individualism and my own property rights, residents also explain support for fracking in light of their relations with and their obligations to the community. It was widely believed that most residents supported fracking, and surveys would indicate this to be a belief that has, some truth behind it. And also, most people believe that the community as a whole was benefiting, even if they personally were not, right? Everybody knew a farmer who was able to get a new roof on the barn and get a new pickup truck because of the industry. So-and-so's cousin got a job driving a truck, right? Everybody could point to some economic benefit. And so they said, even if it's not working out for me, it's working out for others, right? Also, it was widely believed that anti-fracking activists or fractivists were predominantly urban liberals who, as Representative Garth Everett remarked, have no clue about rural values. There's something to the people's belief about that. So when I was there, there was an area right along the Susquehanna River, West Branch, where people were living in trailer homes and then the owner who owned the land on which the trailer homes were sold it to a company that was going to withdraw water for the industry. And so these were considered to be like the first displaced people from the fracking industry. And this was in the wake, there was still a lot of momentum around Occupy Wall Street. So a bunch of protesters came in and called it Occupy Riverdale and camped out at the site and held up signs saying Pittsburgh contingency, Philadelphia contingency, New York City contingency. As well, at the time that I was there, Sean Lennon, Yoko Ono, Susan Sarandon, Mark Ruffalo did a much publicized tour of a big tour bus through the area, getting out at gas wells and protesting. And so this stuck with people that lived here. Tom and Mary Crawley, who lived next door to Doyle and Peggy Bodle, also wound up with explosive levels in their methane water, pointed this out to me as the reason why they were not willing, in Tom's words, to raise a stink about their situation. They refused to talk to the media or environmental groups. They refused to talk to me for over a year until I convinced them that my book wasn't going to come out for like 5 years. It turned out to be 8. And that they're like, oh, we'll be done with our lawsuit by then, so fine, we'll talk to you. And I agreed not to tell their story until the book came out. So Tom in particular worried that environmentalists from outside the community who heard about the case would demonize their nice old neighbor whose property hosted the gas well that contaminated their water. And they pointed to Occupy and Riverdale for reason for believing that might actually happen, right? Oh gosh, Mary, his wife, said, no picket lines. Tom added, we're afraid everybody's gonna camp out on their property and blame them. And it's not their fault, so we're just not saying anything. In this light, supporting fracking was viewed as a way of showing solidarity with the community against outsiders, even if you personally were suffering from this. And I'll just add, the Crawleys were struggling to find a lawyer that they could afford. An environmental activist group offered them a free lawyer, but they wouldn't take it because they were afraid of being seen as associated with the anti-fracking group. Okay, so the second thing I want to talk about is how lessors invoke, they don't use Locke's term, but they basically invoke their natural right to do what they wanted on their own property, to land sovereignty, but that invoking this natural right has the ironic effect of eroding others' freedom over their own estate and to be left alone. Scott McLean lived at a dead-end gravel road called Stony Gap at the base of Coal Mountain on a simple ranch home on 5 rugged acres. As I came to know Scott, he basically had a belief that almost every social institution of more than 2 people was corrupt. Corporations, the government agencies charged with regulating them, the police, NGOs, the local township supervisors, all corrupt. I came to see him as having a Rousseauian outlook. It's civilization itself that corrupts. Living an isolated, as close as possible to self-reliant existence, close to nature, was noble and liberating. Private property was the font from which Scott's sense of autonomy flowed. Like Thomas Jefferson, he believed that his homestead, as he called it, was his best defense against government overreach and the debasing influence of the city. Scott had built a large berm right next to his house so that rain coming down off the mountain wouldn't touch his house. He got a citation for it because he didn't get a permit for getting an earth mover moving such massive amounts of land. He refused to pay the fine. He spit on the idea that the berm was illegal. The state has no authority, he bellowed. This is my land. I'm king. The landowners that I met, like Scott and George, didn't justify their politics. They didn't bother justifying their politics by quoting people like John Stuart Mill. But in practice, they tacitly abided the liberalist social contract, live and let live. When it came to leasing their mineral rights, none of them thought that others had a right to veto their decision. The very idea of needing somebody else's consent to improve the use value of your own property was almost unthinkable, if not immoral, because it entailed restrictions on personal and economic freedom. But even John Locke, who of course famously conceptualized land sovereignty as a natural right, recognized that there are limits to an individual's private right to enjoy their property. In what has become known as the Lockean Proviso, Locke argued that your right to your property is only clear and exclusive so long as it does not jeopardize other people's ability to enjoy the benefits of their own property, right? This is sort of similar of like freedom of speech. My right is limited where my fist meets your face, right? In that way. So American property law sanctions the Lockean Proviso in all kinds of ways, even though we have some of the most maximalist private property protections. You can think about zoning ordinances, building permits, liquor licenses, restrictive covenants, easements. All of these are restrictions on individuals' land sovereignty, and the argument for them is that the position of others ought not be worsened by you exercising your rights on your own property. Right? And so I think you've probably figured this out already from the talk, if you didn't know before you came here, that private land leasing for fracking violates the Lockean Proviso as a matter of course. It inherently creates spillover effects that worsen the well-being of others in the community and infringe on their freedom to benefit from their own property. Just ask Scott McLean. So what's pictured here, so Scott had leased his 5 acres. He supports fracking. He also, though, knew that he would never wind up with gas wells on his property. They want big areas, so they're going to drill underneath his property, right? So, and however, though, so up at the top of the mountain is a hunting camp, 4-shot hunting camp. This is a pretty common thing out here. So different families go together and buy a large swath of land, and seasonally they go and hunt, and then their descendants inherit them, right? And so Porshot owns 1,000 acres at the top of the mountain. Before fracking came along in the early 2000s, Porshot approached Scott and said, your driveway ends at the base of the mountain. We have to go around to the other side and then climb up the hill. Would you let us build a driveway off your driveway and then also have access to your driveway to get from the road so that we can get to our hunting camp? Scott said, absolutely, it's the neighborly thing to do. He even got a legal easement so that if he sold the property, the next property owner couldn't deny access to Porshot. Now, Porshot leases. What do you think that gas company wants to do? Put a bunch of well pads up top there, which means what? These heavy trucks driving up and down Scott's road. This was a Facebook page he created just to draw attention to what was happening. So this road, of course, this gravel driveway is not built for these big rigs. He had the culvert for a street. The culvert collapsed several times. The chimney of his house collapsed. His foundation cracked. Scott went out and started blocking the trucks from going up and down. Scott carries a pistol on his side. The workers accused him of menacing them. He was arrested on his own property for trying to prevent the trucks from going up and down. Right? It's my driveway, Scott fumed. He complained that his neighbors were endangering his property and his own livelihood. He eventually gave up and walked away from the property, selling it as a loss. Moving away was something Tom and Mary Crawley were considering. I've already introduced them in passing. They live next to the Bodles who you saw with the dirty dishes and the like. What this is right here is they had explosive levels of methane in their water after a well was drilled on the other side of the mountain. This is a vent the gas company installed to try to get as much of the methane out before it comes into their house so they don't have explosive levels of methane coming out of their faucet, right? Nonetheless, this is their water after the vent. You won't really be able to hear the sound that well, but you can still see it, but it's basically fizzing like soda and there's no
God. Well, we never had that before.
No, that's just it.
Next 3 years on, at that point, that they had been living with that water. They didn't drink it anymore. They still used it for some things like bathing. And so by the time I met them, it had been 3 years since they stopped drinking the water after the gas well was drilled, as I mentioned, like 2,000 feet away. The gas company was issued a violation. The DEP said it was faulty cement casing. Unsurprisingly, the gas company did its own investigation and determined that they were not the cause of the methane in the water was naturally occurring, even though they had baseline water tests showing they did not have methane in the water. To this day, the company denies responsibility. To this day, their water is still doing that. The creek is still fizzing with methane 11 years later. What Tom and Mary couldn't have anticipated, let alone control, was the extent to which their neighbor's private land use decision to allow gas drilling on their property exposed them involuntarily to harm. While these are extreme cases, there are thousands of mundane ways that land leasing infringes on others' land sovereignty. Restricted driveway access. You might get a note in your mailbox that says tomorrow you can't use your driveway between the hours of 8 and 4 because of heavy trucks, right? View sheds disturbed, right? Roads, that famously these trucks create pockmarks, potholes all over the roads. Noise, loss of night sky. These are just some visuals. So these are neighbors looking out at next door where flaring is happening. This is a person looking out their front porch at a drilling rig. This is the night sky with so much flaring, people derisively call it Fracker Borealis, right? And then this is me waiting behind a bunch of trucks that are going to withdraw water from the creek, and I'm not allowed to pass until every one of them is done withdrawing water from the creek, right? So as I watch residents like the Crawleys involuntarily absorb the sometimes catastrophic spillover effects from their neighbors' ostensibly private land use decisions, a deep irony became apparent. The legally protected freedom to exploit one's mineral rights eroded the freedom of others, their right to be left alone and their sovereignty over their own estate. Behavioral sciences and others endlessly talk about and analyze resource dilemmas, but often use anodyne language of game theory, defectors, free riders. We don't really talk about it as much as far as how people's civil liberties are threatened. So to zoom out a bit to a sort of big idea that animates the book, which very much is just in line with people who talk about resource dilemmas. But the live and let live social contract that I argue governs community relations in these places is actually a staple of American political discourse writ large. This isn't something that is only believed by conservative people in Appalachia or whatever, right? The liberalist maxim is grounded in the premise, though, this live and let live, that there's a sphere of private life that is distinct from public life. Why I'm allowed to love who I want to love, say what I want to say, worship how I want to worship, is that even if you're offended, it does not infringe on your ability to love who you want to love. So in that way, it's viewed as separate from the public domain, right? But as Naomi Oreskes and others argued in a recent paper, macro-environmental problems erase the barrier between private and public domain. Seemingly innocent and inconsequential individual actions, eating meat, driving an SUV, that are traditionally construed as private, and so not deserving of any kind of regulation, when they're amplified by technology and by the number of people doing them, they infiltrate the public sphere in the form of greenhouse gases and other pollutants. And when they do, they harm the public good by contributing to global plight, species extinction, climate change, and so on. I call this the public-private paradox. Our private decisions are public when it comes to the environment. In the aggregate, our lifestyle choices trespass on other sovereignty in ways that are akin to the spillover effects of the Crawleys' neighbors' decision to lease their land. It's just harder for us to trace the connections around the globe and into the future than it is when they're right next door to you. In the epoch of climate change, personal liberty is increasingly becoming a zero-sum game. My gain is your loss. Now, interestingly, when it came to matters in this community that were thought to be in the public interest and that were legally structured to be in the public interest, many locals endorsed civic association. Even George, for instance, he was involved in a civic association. He was on the Montoursville High School school board. This was the school that he swept the floors and mopped the floors for 25 years. And as a part of his work there, he was engaged in a passionate fight. He was the leader of it that he lost to try to preserve the old high school and prevent it from being torn down. And so he had this idea that this was a community landmark and ought to be preserved, right? And I should also say that beyond a case like this, dozens of residents in outlying municipalities that might only include a couple hundred tax-paying members, would turn out regularly at monthly Board of Supervisor hearings to give their input on really mundane matters. Ought we put a stop sign or a traffic light at this intersection? Ought we replace this guardrail, right? People were really passionate about turning up to these things and having a say in them. And so, but there were no public referenda or town hall debates about whether the community should allow land leasing for fracking. Even though other issues that impacted the Commonwealth were debated and decided in town hall style formats, placing a cell phone tower on one's yard or getting a liquor license for one's business requires more public input than leasing for fracking. Why? Pennsylvania, like every other major oil and gas producing state, decided to preempt local zoning, to take away municipalities' ability to use the basic tool that they use. You zone an area residential or you zone an area rural and you say we don't allow industrial processes here. You can't put a parking lot here. You can't put a factory here. The oil and gas industry successfully convinced politicians that we can't have different zoning rules every community we go in. We need uniform standards, right? So Pennsylvania enacted their own rules and said, as long as a gas well is 500 feet from the nearest residence or drinking source, you need to allow it in every zone, right? So they took away municipalities' ability to control fracking through zoning. Preemption enraged many residents who participated in Board of Supervisor meetings. They endorsed or took for granted that Board of Supervisor meetings were a place where they could voice their concern over new land uses and be a part of deliberating decisions that would impact the community. Now, what I should say is the time that I was here, when a new gas well was permitted, so after land had been leased and now the company wanted to drill, they did actually still have to have a Board of Supervisor meeting. But it was a farce. So people would turn up. Some of them would do their own research and they would say, I saw all these heavy trucks and they're going right by a school. This could put the students at risk. But as long as the new permit met state requirements, the Board of Supervisors had to approve it. There was one instance where the Board of Supervisors didn't and they got sued and lost, right? So, and Board of Supervisors lived in fear of being bankrupted by such a lawsuit. So there was still these Board of Supervisor meetings. People would turn up and then the Board of Supervisors say, I'm sorry, we have to approve the permit, even though you've raised really important concerns, right? So for Alexis de Tocqueville and historically for conservatives as well, home rule invigorates democracy, right? And another sort of conversation, political economist Eleanor Ostrom, home rule was a mechanism for mitigating resource dilemmas, right? If we create the conditions that foster trust, accountability, egalitarian decision-making at the local level, Ostrom believed that a kind of civic environmentalism could take root in communities. Locals would come to view restraints on land use as legitimate because they're adapted conditions on the ground and because they're constructed by the very people who use the resource and will be impacted by using those resources, rather than rules that are designed at some distant capital by bureaucrats, right? If we take a more expansive view of the commons to incorporate quality of life, tranquility, night sky, view sheds, it becomes apparent that zoning ordinances are effectively communal agreements to restrict private property rights in the name of conserving some finite shared resource. That might be groundwater, that might be something more intangible like rural character, which is actually a term built into zoning, right, in certain places to protect rural character. So Board of Supervisor meetings and other public hearings are venues where locals can deliberate on a case-by-case basis and decide whether a particular use is compatible with the needs of the community. If not, they can petition their Board of Supervisors to reject them. Now, I should say that Pennsylvania's Act 13, which preempted local zoning, was deemed unconstitutional by the state Supreme Court. However, since that ruling, which was 9 years ago, 3 municipalities have attempted to create their own restrictions that are greater than the state and have been sued by their own Department of Environmental Protection, who says that oil and gas regulations are a statewide issue and cannot be decided at the local level, right? And so even though it's allegedly been deemed unconstitutional, there actually has been very little change on the ground. So to wrap up, it's hard to have any, for me, to think of any like grand solutions to this problem because there's a disconnect here. Personally, I believe that the kind of rapid decarbonization that, that we need, leaving fossil fuels in the ground, requires the kinds of structural transformations that most of the people I came to know reject, right? And they don't like the idea of bureaucracies telling them what they can or can't do on their own property. Also, and I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A, I'm quite alert to the fact that an argument about empowering local communities to have greater control over fracking, well, we also need to lay transmission lines for renewables, and to the extent that you empower local communities, they can reject those kinds of things too, right? NIMBYism around renewable energy infrastructure. So I'm sensitive to that as well, right? But what I will say is this, we know that the poorer and more rural a county or a state is, the more likely it is to suffer from pollution. At the same time, these are also the reddest regions of the United States where people have rejected environmental regulation of the federal government and often even of the state government. And yet, many of the true believers I met in greater Williamsport have become disaffected from the industry over time. So George Hagemeyer, who I introduced you at the beginning, I actually invited him to my class, and the idea was I invited him and an anti-fracking activist, and they were supposed to present dueling perspectives. George was going to come and talk about how great the industry was, and then there was going to be a representative from an activist group. And then George showed up and told my class he wished he never released. It was this amazing moment. And And I will say nothing catastrophic happened. It wasn't like his water got contaminated, but it was that he didn't realize the extent to which you become a tenant on your own property when you lease your land. He, for instance, was threatened with arrest when a camera that they put on the well pad that he didn't know was there caught him taking a shortcut across the well pad in his back field, and he was told he'd be arrested for trespassing on his own property. The final straw was when he was pulling in his driveway and the security guard that was in the shack put out a stop sign and told him he had to come back later because they were moving heavy truck traffic in and out. So he couldn't access his own driveway, right? So all those kind of minor indignities strung together, he lost his land sovereignty, right? In that way. And so if anti-fracking activists, and I write about, I'm happy to talk about this word Q&A because I have a whole chapter about their relationships with anti-fracking activists. But if they articulated policies in addition to the other work they're doing, you can't stop pushing for federal regulation, but if they also articulated or found points of articulation for policies that harmonize with what people I met called rural values, for instance, highly localized community control over land use decisions, they could, I believe, bring people like George on board. And I should note as well, and you're probably aware of this, some of you, but that the idea of land sovereignty at the local level and community-led resource management is a major cornerstone, for better or worse, of Biden's American the Beautiful initiative, right? Like if we're going to protect 30% of land by 2030, most of that is going to have to be convincing privately owned or private owners of private land to do things, right, locally. And I should say, when it comes to people like George actually began turning up at Board of Supervisor meetings a couple of years ago and offering testimony about the things that had happened to him that made him skeptical about the industry. And he started floating the idea of temporarily halting permits for new gas wells until the scales were tipped more in favor of landowners' rights. But his elected local leaders couldn't do anything. Their hands were tied, right? Because the state DP was suing towns that attempted to create greater regulations. So many of the communities right now in Pennsylvania, Texas, Colorado, elsewhere that are fighting to try to enact local restrictions or bans on fracking are in conservative-leaning districts. It's pretty interesting. I don't actually know of a single community that is trying to create local regulations, and across all these states, they're getting sued by their own state. I don't know of any of them, even the conservative ones, that want less regulations than what the state wants. Even in conservative areas, they want greater restrictions, right? And so the lesson to me is that many rural residents are willing to support greater oversight of the industry if they get to help write the rules, right? So if the essence of democracy in America is that people have a say over and must consent to policies that affect their lives, then community self-rule is arguably its most ideal form. It's direct democracy, right, rather than representative democracy. Pennsylvania presents an interesting opportunity. Pennsylvania is one of 6 states that has an environmental rights amendment in its constitution. This would seem to provide a strong, though rarely tested in court to date, legal foundation for communities to regulate fracking. And you see this actually, there's 2 townships that have written local ordinances that don't allow wastewater injection sites. They were sued by the State Department of Environmental Protection there, but they are working with an environmental advocacy group, a pretty progressive one, CELDF, even though these are conservative communities, because the CELDF figured out that if you make it an issue about local democracy and not about the environment, you can get on board with them. And they're arguing that enacting this ban locally is invoking the Environmental Rights Amendment. So they're not creating a local law that's inconsistent with state law, even though what the DEP is saying. They're saying actually the DEP has failed to protect citizens' right to clean air and water. So we're creating this local law. Pennsylvania is a home rule state, so we're creating home rule to protect that right. This, of course, is what happened recently in the famous Montana lawsuit. Montana also has an Environmental Rights Amendment, and so these youth that sued and said that the state has to reduce its climate emissions from mining because it's inconsistent with residents' right to clean air and water, right? And so this seems like it's a way forward, and it's not only as a sort of strategy for environmental protection, but a strategy for getting rural and more conservative-minded people on board to make this about local control, right, in this way. So, of course, it's facile to frame the resource dilemma associated with land leasing in America as unavoidable, or to paint the lessors as the bad guys. It's a result of a unique legal and political structure that does 3 things. 1, it constitutionally enshrines and grants preeminence to private subsurface mineral ownership. This does, of course, give individuals the opportunity to make money directly, But it also puts the onus of underground mining decisions on individual landowners rather than on the state. Two, this legal and political structure doesn't account for most of the externalities that neighbors and the planet absorb from oil and gas activity on leased land. Three, this legal political structure, as I've already talked extensively about now, strips communities of their traditional autonomy to ensure that private property rights don't jeopardize the Commonwealth. It's within this system that makes it so hard for landowners like most of us to avoid the public-private paradox. I have some hope that perhaps if more of us recognize that the externalities produced by personal land and energy use choices violate others' human rights and the social contract, that maybe more people would push for green energy policies that rein in these externalities in the name of other core American principles, namely fairness and democracy. After all, the idea that everyone deserves the same freedoms and that every community stakeholder should have a say in decisions that affect them is as American as Little League Baseball. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions you have. Right off the bat, my Williamsport guy.
Full disclosure, I spent the first 20 years of my life in Williamsport. My family's been there over 100 years. I went to like coming to college.
Yeah.
Then I've been gone for things. So I just have two things. One of the things is already addressed. I have a close relative who will remain unnamed, but had 100 acres, has 100 acres of land. Leased it, then allowed them to put a pipeline across it.
Yeah.
All for pretty, not bad gain.
Yeah.
As far as money goes.
Yep.
And his neighbors also did the same thing.
Yep.
His one neighbor, though, allowed them to put a pad about 600 or 700 meters from this person's house, and this person cannot sleep at night because of the ridiculous noise. So this is a long way of saying, actually, this person's my brother, but that's the but they started out. I argued. I said, you don't want to do this. You don't want to do this.
Yeah.
These people are great.
Yeah.
They're lovely. You know, they're not going to do anything we don't want them to.
Yeah.
Well, as you said, over the years, I'm wondering how many of those people back in 2014 that you found supported have now come to not support the industry anymore, because at least the family that I have there started out loving them. Now they're like, this is ridiculous. You know, we have no say over anything anymore. Yeah. Trucks all over the place. So how much do you think that has changed? And then I have one other quick question for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's most of the people, almost everybody that I follow, the landowners I came to know, are not that excited about the industry anymore. So all of them have some degree of that experience. Some of them have a lot. What is interesting is only one of them actually decided to publicly become an anti-fracking, like to publicly speak out repeatedly and say, I do not support this industry. So still others are like, well, I'm really pissed at what they did and there ought to be more landowner protections. So it's interesting that the response is still often from the people that I really follow closely anyway, like an individual one, like I just need more protections personally, right? Not this sort of like viewed as like some kind of systemic change. But that sentiment is really common. I mean, Scott was the same. And I mean, and even other things like so another this happened to George too, but it happened to several people I follow, is like they sort of thought like, well, finally, once they do all this crap, and maybe I always got to live with this well pad, but at least it quiets down. But that they didn't know that then you can use it as a staging ground. So then there could be a man camp, like dozens of trailers put there with people living in them, because now they're using it as a staging ground for fracking next door, right? And like sometimes people like literally just see a bunch of trucks pulling up and temporary trailers being put on their pad, right? And so absolutely, and this is where I was kind of ending, like where there might be hope is like, you know, I don't think that you're going to get all of them to like come out and say ban fracking, but as far as saying like push for among these people that are really disillusioned and that now feel like, yeah, why is it that like I can't even show up at a board of supervisor meeting and say we ought to not let this happen this close to one's house, right? So absolutely, I think that is a broader sentiment.
Yeah, the other thing that amazed me when this happened is I mean, you know, you go to North Williamsport and rain the mountains and fly fish from there.
Yeah.
So I love, you know, and a lot of the economy and a lot of the, I'm trying to think of the word for it, the, you know, who the people are is really based on the idea of this is kind of wilderness. beautiful environment, etc. But those are the same people that drove me crazy.
Yeah.
That were loving the gas industry when they came in,
Yep.
and still will argue with you
Yeah.
that it's a wonderful thing. And
Yeah.
I don't know how to put those two things together. I don't know if you have a better idea
Yeah.
how to put those together.
Yeah, well, I think I can't say I have like an answer to how that is all logically consistent. What I will say is that I recognize and write about that kind of split view. So I have a whole chapter on, as you probably well know, a lot of those areas are protected state forests that have been leased for drilling. I mean, Tiadaghton is like decimated.
Yeah.
And so and parts of Loyalsock. And so what was interesting about that was, and I write about, there's a particular local anti-fracking group that nobody paid any attention to, they made fun of. They weren't really able to get anything done, except they discovered that a particularly treasured part of the Loyalsock Rock Run was going to be drilled. They were the ones that first found out that this was going to happen. They found the plans, they publicized it, they started a campaign to prevent drilling around Rock Run that was incredibly successful. And a lot of people like George, who were excited about on their own property, were really angry that this place where they go fishing and swimming. And so that kind of, what I say is like, there's irony to that. I don't know how they explain that. The hope I try to take from it is that there's some part of them that recognizes that there's public good. That Loyalsock is a public good that ought not be exploited for profit in that way, and that and that to the extent that that's there, and certainly for the group, they sort of viewed that as it was their one great success and their one way that they were able to enroll people in a project. So they did actually get thousands of people to sign petitions, to turn up and yell at local. There was like some big meeting of like 800 people turned up, which is a lot at Lycoming College, to say this ought not happen, and they weren't satisfied and like shouted down the gas company and the state, the sort of state representatives. And so there was an opportunity and a connection for mobilization there. But I'd love to talk to you more. Amazing.
And I should note that Dan is also the state climatologist, so now he's on the Okay, other questions? Comments?
I'm sorry.
In their water, like health effects that you ran into?
Yeah, so, and the gas industry loves to point this out. There's methane in your water isn't actually linked to particular health issues. So gas companies like, well, you got some methane in your water. We didn't put it there, but anyway, you can drink it. And so, so and actually, and everybody that I know that, and I should say, most people don't wind up with explosive methane in the water. I followed 6 families that were all right around this one gas well. Of course, we don't really know how many there are, because if the gas companies do decide to, they never admit responsibility, but fine, we'll give you some money, sign a non-disclosure agreement. Now we don't know. But so I think that there are, and there now have been more recent studies that are showing health impacts, including like cancer clusters in the Southwest. It's probably not methane, it's the other crap they're bringing up. I mean, there's all kinds of, there's naturally occurring radiation, there's arsenic, there's all kinds of things they're bringing up from the ground. Of course, the book that won the Pulitzer, Amity and Prosperity, right? She followed. Now, thankfully, that doesn't occur anymore. But it was commonly the case up until around 2013 to 15 when it started to transition out, that you have these impoundment ponds where you have the water that you put a bunch of water, you put a rubber liner, dig a pit, maybe like 18 acres, 20 acres, fill with water, frack the well, the wastewater comes back up, you just put it in the pit. Of course it leaks, right? Those rubber liners don't hold it. And so she follows a particular family who experienced some pretty catastrophic health effects. So then finally, fine, we're not going to put it. Now the industry brags that they recycle the water, they dispose of it in injection wells, which have been linked to earthquakes. But but there's many parts of the process. It's usually not methane that are linked to health effects.
And Nora mentioned that our PhD student Mayu, that is part of this dissertation, is looking at a perception of the water treatment that they're doing and whether it was just over there. Other questions? Yes.
First of all, I appreciate the perspective on like meeting people where they're at. I think like being able to connect them where our values are similar will make a lot better conversations. So I really like that part of it.
Thank you.
And just following this idea of like, how do we change hearts and minds? I'm just curious what your perspective is on why certain communities might have such a strong individualistic idea of things versus communalism. Just like, I don't know where that comes from. It's something I'm very curious about, and why it seems so hard to break through that. And talk about this larger conversation about what's happening. And I'm sure it's different everywhere, but being from that area, I'm just
well, it's funny you should say me being from that area, because I mean, as somebody who grew up outside of Philadelphia, I'm in the like. So people talk about Pennsylvania is the T. There's Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. What did Carville say? Kentucky in between, or Alabama in between, or something. But it's like the northern tier in the middle are an entirely different world in Pittsburgh and Philly. And they basically look at those two areas as like urban liberal shitholes, right? Where all of our tax money gets sucked and there's welfare handed out. I mean, I'm being a little ungenerous, but you get just to make the point. So yeah, I don't really. From my position, I don't feel comfortable like definitively stating where this stuff comes from. I mean, I will say I talk a little bit in the book that I do think it's interesting that people. So Williamsport, as you may know, one of the things that happened in this area is there was a period. So Pennsylvania is unique in that I'm not saying they got a fair deal, but land was not taken from Native Americans. It was actually bought. So William Penn was a Quaker, and he believed in trying to do a little better. So he successfully bought more land from Native Americans. So there was a period though where about 20 years where there was an area in which white settlers were living, but that was claimed by the Iroquois. And this was where Williamsport is today. And so there is this by the time, and what is really fascinating to me to find these documents is when William Penn had that land purchased, these people made the Lockean argument. They said, for 20 years, we've improved this land, right? We've turned it from a wilderness and we've protected it. So we are owed this land without paying for it, right? Because we've transformed it from valueless to value. This is the Locke argument for how property becomes private, right? And then in addition to that, it is claimed, it's apocryphal, but it is claimed that on the same day that the Declaration of Independence was signed in Philadelphia, that locals met under a tree outside of Williamsport and signed their own Declaration of Independence, not knowing what was going on in Philadelphia, and that this document was taken on a horse to Philadelphia but disappeared. So it's just to say there is this kind of like, I don't say the reason, but there's this, some people know this, that there's this history of this being having an independent streak, of being kind of frontier, and then more broadly, if you want to go back and talk about this as the sort of northern stretch of Appalachia, it is representatives from Pennsylvania and Kentucky who participated in the Whiskey Rebellion, the first tax that George Washington implemented, in the United States of America, and took up arms against Washington's troops to try to say, you can't tell what to do. So there's a kind of argument, something like about Appalachian culture having this kind of libertarian streak to it, right? From Colin Woodard makes an argument about like, well, it was Scotch-Irish, people who settled the area, who came from rugged parts of Ireland and Scotland, and who just wanted to have autonomy in that way. So there's various ways that people talk about it, maybe Appalachian culture, maybe who settled it, and the like, that may explain this particular area. I sort of try to say in the book, like, at least like, it's not, maybe there's something to that, but like this idea of individual freedom seems to be something that a lot of people grow up believing and hearing as an ideal, even if what they do doesn't match with it, But
okay. Also, online friends, if you want to ask a question, feel free to just unmute and ask.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, so I'm also from the Philly area, and I've done some work on fracking. And for the subject of why people don't speak out, even after they've sort of changed their minds about supporting fracking, could you talk a little bit about some of the industry pushback if they do? Like, I think you've encountered Energy in Depth and Marcellus Drilling and those outlets.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just laughing because Energy in Depth, which is like this, and Tom Shepstone is like, they are a news organization providing news about the fracking industry. It was, paid by the fracking industry. And I'm laughing because when my book came out, they of course needed to character assassinate me. And I'm quite proud of the fact that the best they could come up with is a video that the College of Arts and Science at NYU produced. Because I have an espresso machine in my office, and I like offer coffee to students, and I made this video to like encourage students to come to my office hours, and like I'll make you a coffee, and they're like, look at this espresso sipping Manhattan, and so that was like their thing, is they posted this video, and like that's how out of touch I am. So yes, I've encountered them for sure. Now I think that, but as far as the broader question, yeah. So there was a family. I was so heartbroken for this family personally, and I admit upset about the narrative for my book. There was a family that I wrote about who wound up in a different area, not these 6 families, with explosive levels of methane in their water. And I had a huge portion of the book about them. And then finally, after 12 years of fighting the gas company, they reached a settlement that included a non-disclosure agreement. And now legally, I could have still told their story because the NDA, they had talked to me and I recorded it long before the NDA happened. But, I went back and talked to everybody before I published the book. I could talk about it, how I think about research ethics, which isn't always just the way IRB thinks about it. But so I went back to them and they're like, I'm sorry, even if you use pseudonyms, even if you say nothing that would indicate where we live, whatever, I'm just so scared of this industry. I fought so long to get a pittance for a payout that's not even half of what we spent building this house, and I'm so done, and I just don't, and so you can't even mention the story in writing anywhere, even if you don't say who we are, in this way. And so yes, NDAs are the most powerful way that the industry silences people, and I think that folks that I was talking to, as I said, like they didn't want to talk to me. Once they settled their lawsuit, it was at least easier to talk to me. So I think that is an important part of it. I can't really say, I have to say, as far as like energy and depth and those kind of groups, in some ways, I don't want to exaggerate their influence because sometimes it was laughable. So for instance, when they screened Gasland 2 in Williamsport, Josh Fox came, huge turnout, like buses coming from all around, thousands of people, big event. So energy and depth said, we're going to stage a block away a counter screening of Frackination, which is the pro-fracking documentary, right? And they invited all royalty owners to come, and there was 9 people there, right? And it's like that. It's like, and the people I talked to, they're like, yeah, like I'm not gonna show up and be like for them, I'm not gonna be a poster child for them, like and so in that way, they were there and they were doing their thing. Locals were aware of it, but in that way, I don't think they were afraid of Tom Shepstone, for instance, who's like the biggest gadfly who posts on here all the time.
As someone who dives deep into these issues and you get to know these people and there's some sort of your personal values are attached to the work you're doing, how do you separate the research from the feelings of that you come to have when you go into a community like this? Like it's depressing, I'd assume.
Yeah.
And so how do you stay motivated and feel good about the work you're doing, even when the work you're doing and the research you're doing is super depressing?
Yeah. Well, there's actually like a couple questions bundled in there, because one is just sort of about like emotion management. Another one may be more about like my relationship to my participants, right? Like either politically or socially or otherwise. Ethnography's really involved in this way, and it was lonely. I mean, I have a wife I left in Manhattan, and I rented an apartment in this place where I didn't know anybody, and where and actually while I was living in town, most of the I want to talk to landowners primarily, so they're out around the town, they're not in the town. So it's like might be 2 hours driving to get to somebody in between people and the like, and then coming back home to my lonely apartment at night. And a lot of the stuff, so for instance, and I talk about this in the big book a bit, but when the very worst day I had in the field personally, and it's not about me, but you asked a question about me. So I was standing with George on this berm when he was looking at these dehydrators. And George said, boy, I can't wait till those things are off the pad. And I said, you're not gonna be alive when they're off the pad. What are you talking about? Because, so these will be here as long as the wells are productive, which would be 30 or 40 years. But by the way, there's Utica shale under Marcellus shale. If they drill Utica, the lease goes on for as long, and these stay here as long as the wells are productive. And George was like, oh, well, these are just like sheds. They're work, like, these are just while they're in this process of setting up the well pad. I said, no, they're not. These are gonna be here for at least 30 or 40 years. He didn't believe me. So I went home, like, got documents, all the stuff, and came back. And he just started cursing and crying. And I was the one delivering to him this news, right? Because so that's the thing is, there's a berm here. When he's at his house, he can't see the gravel path. It's kind of okay. He sees this shit. I mean, he sees this, right? And it's the same too, I should say. There's days where they're burning off these VOCs, and it's bad enough that not only does he close the windows, he's putting rags in them because it's irritating his eyes. And being like, oh, I can't wait till, like, that's just something because these in the early, no, you know. And so, it's, yeah, those kind of things are hard. I mean, how I stay motivated. I mean, in particular, there's moments, but like when the Crawleys told me, after a year of me trying to get them to talk to me, that they would talk to me and no one else. And as long as I didn't share any of their story until the book was published, that they would entrust that with me. That's a lot of motivation. That's like the people putting their, you know, and not their trust in me that I'm gonna just represent them in a nice way. That's not, but that I'm the one that's gonna tell their story. And I wound up writing like a New York Times article in the Sunday Review about them, which was this whole other thing. But that brought a lot of attention to them, a lot negative too, actually, by the way. But that is incredibly motivating, just that, you know, because these people, and that's what's interesting, despite the jokes, especially when it first came, oh, professor from New York City, like, I know where you stand, that I can become friends with a number of folks there. That's motivating. The more you become attached to someone, the more when crappy things happen to them, yeah, that makes you feel bad, but it also makes you want to meet. I mean, I personally get to walk away. And so I should at least try to be somebody that helps be there for you, because as bad as it is, like, I have an eject button. I'm going back to my apartment in Manhattan. And so, you know, so yeah. I would just say, which sort of maybe relates, but it's like people always ask like the positionality thing, like, you know, yeah, we have to leave fossil fuels in the ground. I'm liberal, you know. That stuff is like, that's what's great about ethnography. Ethnography is stalking, right? So there's like people, I show up early and I'm like, hey, can I talk to you? They're like, oh, I don't know, whatever. And then it's like, now they're at church. It's like, oh, this dude's at church, you know? They're like, yeah, no. And then now I'm like at the Little League game because their friend is talking to me. And then at some point they're like, whoa, you're like hanging out with all my friends. You know, and so sometimes people are like skeptical at first for various reasons, whether it's politics or otherwise. I should say too, a lot of people really didn't care even from the beginning. And it was, in some ways it was easy. Like even by the time I got there, a lot of journalists had come through and were writing stories. So I'm like, yeah, I'm a sociologist, right? But they're like, oh yeah, I talked to a journalist before. And so they kind of had this like, okay, yeah, people want to tell stories about us. But it's like, I think as far as like the difference question, which isn't exactly what you asked, but it's like me being different from them and what people disclose to you or not because they think you're like them or not. That matters a lot more in a one-off interview where, you know, but it's like, if you tell me something and you're dissembling and you're hiding things because you think, whether just because you want to be private or because of my politics, and then I keep seeing you. And I see you across settings where you're doing stuff that you told me is not what you do or what you think. I don't put all that stock in just what you said to me in an interview. I'm connecting it to what I see. I should also say that people can talk about all the differences. I'm white. I'm from Pennsylvania. Like, and I could see ways that sounds. We talked about this at lunch. I have an African-American wife. And when she came to Williamsport, she got treated differently by strangers than I got treated by strangers, right? And I'm not going to say I don't know. The counterfactual would have been impossible for her to do this field work. I don't think it would have been impossible, but I do think that there was frictions I didn't have to deal with because when you're looking at me, you know, you don't know that I'm not from here and I'm not from a place like this, you know. So yeah.
I have a follow-up question.
Anyone online? Another question? Okay, thank you. Over to you. I mean, because we're in such a, students are asking anyhow, we don't have to do the separate thing on the students, it's fine. So please go ahead.
Do you feel like telling their stories was enough? Like, I have this struggle that doing this work and being in academia and getting things published is like, it's not enough. And so, yes, telling their stories is one part of it, but do you like, does that feel like enough for you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really deep question. I think ethnographers have increasingly worried about exploitation. Even if none of the people I'm writing about feel that they're being exploited, we get articles, jobs, tenure, promotion. I got promoted the fool on this book, right? So which doesn't mean anything. Tenure's the big one, but anyway, yeah. So it's like I think increasingly, we worry about, and what are the ways that we can try to what do we owe people that we write about? I don't have a simple answer to that. I wish I made tons of money on this book so that I could just like give them money. I do so like when I wrote the New York Times piece about the Crawleys, I was pleasantly surprised the first time I wrote a piece, an op-ed for the Times, that they actually pay you. I mean, most of you just write them. It's not great, but it's like, whatever. It's like $1,800. So I gave that to them. I mean, that's their story. So give them, go ahead. Like, that's not why I wrote, the article. And I think too, so the Responsible Journal Alliance, which is featured in this book, and featured critically, I should say. I mean, my politics most align with them, but I have a chapter where I basically talk about how bad they are at connecting to local residents. I was really worried about them. Because they don't look great in the book. I don't know, and it's tough love. It's coming from a good place. And there was a moment where, so when the book came out, I did a big event in Williamsport, as we were talking about it. The folks from Responsible Journal Alliance invited me to dinner beforehand. And I should say, I've been talking to people individually, so it's not like I had no idea, but I was sort of like, what's the purpose of it? And what was nice was they were like, we want to really celebrate this book, and we feel like this book, hopefully will help environmental advocates figure out ways to connect. And I said that I'd say I'm really worried because the book is not super flattering of you guys, but that was, and one of the things that Barb said, and then the other people chimed in and agreed, is that like Barb said, but what I appreciate is when I look at myself in that book, I can't deny that that's me. Like, you didn't just portray me as the uncompromising radical activist. You also portrayed my love of natural food, whatever, right? So now it's just say, even the first part of your question, like, I don't think giving voice is enough, but actually even there, a lot of ethnographers only write about their subjects. You come up with your analytical categories and typologies, and that's how you represent people. So I only represent Barb as the fractivist. I only represent George as the landowner, and you only tell parts of their story as they relate to your analytical interests. And so I will say that even that commitment to humanizing people so that when they look at it, they see themselves as an individual is actually a kind of tall order. I mean, it's not heroic, but like even doing that, because a lot of the peer reviewers, they don't care about that per se, and so, but I don't think that it's enough. I mean, one of the things that I've done a lot of, and I've been pleasantly surprised by, but with the RDA, but then also with a number of other environmental groups and with township supervisors from these regions, we've been doing like conversations and workshops around ways that we might be able to protect these communities better. And so, and obviously, and it's like, I'm not doing that as a consultant and getting paid for it, but that's like, and I should say that's been like an incredibly new and rewarding thing for me, is to do that. And so, those other kinds of things are things certainly that I'm trying to do, but I honestly battle with if it's ever enough. I mean, it can be enough in the sense that the people that I wrote about they all seem really happy, except for one, but they all seem really happy, and they don't feel like, or they don't portray to me that they have any kind of like, oh, you got X, Y, or Z out of it. But that doesn't mean that, because they're also not connected to my academic world to see the currency that this book gives me.
Very true. And that one person who was not so happy you relayed was a millionaire environmentalist who was allowed for fracking one.
Yeah.
So, very interesting indeed. So last question, anyone online? And well, thank you so much, Colin. I'd like to just wrap up by a quotation from your talk, which I think really sums up, and even for the physical geography crowd who do game theory and all, this quotation: in the epoch of climate change, personal liberty is becoming a zero-sum game. My gain is your loss. That's really at the crux of a lot of what we're dealing with at multiple levels. As we try to, as geographers, understand this relationship between what can we do? Can there be win-win opportunities where it's not a zero-sum game? Can the engineers come and find the solution? The adaptation crowd in Bangladesh, can they come in and find a way to save the Sundarbans and also have economic development and so on? And in many cases, increasingly, we're seeing that there isn't a win-win. And that's where, these tough choices of the public-private paradox become so seminal. All right, well,